What you're about to witness is the most explosive confrontation between federal law enforcement and state judicial authority ever captured on camera. When this arrogant 42-year-old FBI special agent walked into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom and made the catastrophic mistake of flashing his federal badge, thinking it made him above state law, what happened next would not only destroy his career, but create the most legendary jurisdictional showdown in American legal history. And this story shows us what happens when federal arrogance meets state judicial wisdom, when someone mistakes their federal authority for unlimited power, and when a law enforcement agent discovers that even the FBI answers to the Constitution and the courts that interpret it. Thanks for watching Judge of Justice. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful real-life courtroom moments. Let us know where you're watching from. It's a tense Monday morning in Providence Municipal Court, and Judge Frank Caprio is handling his usual docket of traffic violations and municipal infractions. The late autumn air carries a sense of urgency, and everyone in the courtroom seems focused on resolving their matters quickly and efficiently. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the courtroom doors open with unusual authority, and through them strides Special Agent Marcus Webb, a 42-year-old FBI agent with the Bureau's white-collar crime division. Webb moves with the kind of supreme confidence that comes from years of federal authority, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his federal badge prominently displayed on his belt, and his entire demeanor radiating the superiority complex that federal agents often develop over local and state law enforcement. Special Agent Webb is here because 4 weeks ago he received a citation for speeding in a school zone, 50 mil apparis in a 25 mil appar zone during school hours, while driving his personal vehicle to a non-federal appointment. The fine is $400 plus court costs, but Webb isn't here to pay anything. He's here because he believes his federal law enforcement status should exempt him from what he considers local traffic enforcement that doesn't apply to federal personnel. What Webb doesn't realize is that he's about to challenge a judge who understands federal jurisdiction better than most FBI agents and who has zero tolerance for federal employees who think their badges make them above state and local laws. As Webb approaches the defendant's stand, his body language immediately establishes a confrontational tone. He doesn't remove his federal badge, keeps his FBI credentials prominently visible, and maintains the posture of someone who believes he's doing the court a favor by appearing at all. Special Agent Marcus Webb, the court clerk, announces, reading from the docket. Webb steps forward with obvious impatience, his federal credentials catching the courtroom lights as he positions himself more like an interrogator than a defendant. Judge Caprio looks up from his paperwork with the seasoned eye of someone who has dealt with every form of law enforcement arrogance imaginable, including federal agents who confuse their investigative authority with judicial immunity. Agent Webby. Judge Caprio begins, his voice carrying the measured authority of 35 years interpreting both state and federal law. You're charged with exceeding the speed limit in a school zone, 50 mil PRFs in a 25 mil PRF zone during school hours. This violation of Rhode Island state law occurred on October 22nd at 2:15 p.m. How do you plead? Webb's response immediately signals that this case will become a constitutional showdown unlike anything the courtroom has seen before. Your Honor, Webb says, his voice dripping with federal superiority and barely concealed condescension. I'm pleading not guilty because this citation represents a fundamental misunderstanding of federal law enforcement operational authorities and jurisdictional precedents. Judge Caprio sets down his pen. Never a positive sign for defendants who think they can lecture him about jurisdictional law. Agent Webb, were you conducting official FBI business at the time of the violation? Not at that specific moment, Your Honor, but as a federal law enforcement agent, I maintain certain operational readiness requirements and jurisdictional authorities that supersede local traffic enforcement applications. The courtroom becomes very quiet. Webb has just claimed that his federal badge exempts him from state traffic laws even when he's off duty and conducting personal business. Agent Webb, were you responding to a federal emergency or operating under federal directive? Webb's irritation becomes visible as he realizes he's being pressed for specifics. Your Honor, federal agents operate under different legal frameworks than local law enforcement. We maintain federal authority that requires operational flexibility, not subject to municipal restrictions. Judge Caprio's expression doesn't change, but veteran court watchers recognize the signs of a judge who is about to deliver a constitutional education. Agent Webb, can you cite the specific federal statute or Supreme Court precedent that exempts FBI agents from state traffic laws when conducting personal business? Webb pauses, clearly not having expected to be challenged on constitutional law by a municipal court judge. Your Honor, federal supremacy doctrine establishes that federal law enforcement operations take precedence over local ordinances. The silence that follows is deafening. Webb has just misapplied federal supremacy doctrine while demonstrating fundamental ignorance of constitutional jurisdiction. But Webb isn't finished making the biggest mistake of his federal career. Your Honor, Webb continues, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. I've been a federal agent for 18 years. I think I understand how federal jurisdiction works better than a municipal court judge who deals primarily with local parking tickets and minor infractions. The courtroom erupts in shocked murmurs. Webb has just insulted Judge Caprio's understanding of federal law and suggested that municipal court experience is inferior to federal law enforcement work. What happens next is even more explosive. Webb reaches for his federal badge and holds it up toward Judge Caprio with obvious theatrical intent. Your Honor, this badge represents the authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States Department of Justice. I think that carries more weight than local traffic enforcement. Webb has just flashed his federal badge at a sitting state judge, implying that federal law enforcement authority supersedes state judicial authority. He has crossed a line that will destroy his career and create the most legendary constitutional confrontation in courtroom history. What Judge Caprio does next will systematically demolish Webb's federal arrogance and potentially end his FBI career forever. Judge Caprio slowly stands up from his bench, an unprecedented gesture that signals something monumental is about to happen. He removes his glasses with deliberate precision and looks directly at Webb with the calm, measured expression of someone who is about to deliver the constitutional education of a lifetime. Agent Webb, Judge Caprio says, his voice remaining perfectly controlled, but carrying the full weight of judicial authority. Did you just flash your federal badge at a sitting state court judge to intimidate this court? Webb, still emboldened by what he mistakes for uncertainty, doubles down on his federal supremacy display. Your Honor, I'm simply clarifying the jurisdictional hierarchy that applies to federal law enforcement personnel. Judge Caprio nods slowly as if carefully documenting Webb's constitutional violations for future reference. I see. Agent Webb, since you've questioned this court's understanding of federal jurisdiction and constitutional law, let me ask you some questions about your case and your understanding of the law you claim to represent. The judge opens a thick constitutional law volume that had been sitting on his desk. Agent Webb, you mentioned federal supremacy doctrine. Can you explain to this court the constitutional basis for federal supremacy as established in McCulloch v. Maryland? Webb hesitates, sensing he's walking into a constitutional ambush. Your Honor, federal authority generally takes precedence over state authority in matters of law enforcement. That's not what I asked, Agent Webb. Can you explain the specific constitutional principle established in McCulloch v. Maryland and how it applies to your traffic violation? Webb's confident demeanor begins to crack as he realizes he's being systematically outmatched by someone who knows constitutional law far better than he does. Your Honor, I believe the principle is that federal law supersedes state law. Agent Webb, Judge Caprio interrupts his voice, gaining authority. McCulloch, Maryland established the principle that federal law is supreme only within the scope of federal constitutional authority. It does not establish that federal employees are exempt from state laws that fall within state police powers. Traffic safety is explicitly a state police power under the 10th Amendment. The arrogance starts draining from Webb's face as he realizes he's being constitutionally dismantled by a judge who knows federal law better than he does. Furthermore, Agent Webb, you claim that federal agents operate under different legal frameworks. Are you familiar with the Supreme Court decision in United States v. Bass, which specifically addresses the scope of federal law enforcement authority? Webb's mouth opens and closes as he realizes he's completely out of his constitutional depth. I'll take your silence as confirmation that you're not familiar with that precedent. United States v. Bass establishes that federal law enforcement authority does not exempt federal agents from state laws that are within state constitutional powers when those agents are acting outside their official federal capacity. But Judge Caprio is just getting started. What he reveals next will completely destroy Webb's case and expose his fundamental ignorance of the very constitutional principles he claims to represent. Judge Caprio pulls out another document from his file. Agent Webb, since you flashed your federal badge at this court and claimed federal supremacy, I took the liberty of contacting the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility regarding proper protocol for federal agents appearing in state courts. Webb's face goes completely pale. He clearly hadn't expected his federal supervisors to be contacted. According to FBI Policy Manual Section 5.42, federal agents are explicitly required to comply with all state and local laws when acting in their personal capacity. Were you aware of this policy, Agent Webb? The courtroom is dead silent as Webb realizes the scope of his professional and legal miscalculation. Your Honor, yes, but I thought. Furthermore, Agent Webb, according to the FBI's Professional Responsibility Unit, flashing federal credentials to intimidate state judicial proceedings constitutes abuse of federal authority and conduct prejudicial to the government. Does that sound familiar from your professional training? Webb tries to speak, but Judge Caprio continues with devastating precision. The FBI's Professional Standards Manual specifically states that federal agents who attempt to use their federal status to avoid accountability under state law are subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination. Did they teach you that at Quantico, Agent Webb? Webb's federal arrogance has completely evaporated, replaced by genuine terror as he realizes his career is under direct attack. Your Honor, I never intended to abuse my authority. Agent Webb, intent is irrelevant. You flashed your federal badge at a state court judge while claiming exemption from state law. That's textbook abuse of federal authority. Judge Caprio's voice grows stronger, more authoritative. You suggested that your 18 years of federal experience gave you superior understanding of constitutional law. You insulted this court's knowledge of federal jurisdiction. You demonstrated the exact kind of federal arrogance that undermines public trust in law enforcement. What Judge Caprio announces next will shock everyone and potentially destroy Webb's federal career. Agent Webb, not only am I finding you guilty of the school zone violation and imposing the full $400 fine plus court costs, but I'm also finding you in contempt of court for attempting to intimidate this court with federal credentials. Webb's mouth opens in shock, but Judge Caprio isn't finished. Furthermore, Agent Webb, I'm directing court administration to forward a complete transcript of today's proceedings to the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, along with my judicial finding that you attempted to use federal credentials to obstruct state judicial proceedings. The courtroom buzzes with shock as Webb realizes the implications for his federal career, but most importantly, Judge Caprio continues, standing at his full judicial authority, I'm recommending that the Department of Justice review your fitness to represent federal law enforcement, given your fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional jurisdiction and your documented abuse of federal authority. Webb looks like he's about to collapse as the full weight of his career suicide becomes apparent. Your Honor, you can't destroy my federal career over a traffic ticket. Agent Webb, I'm not destroying your career. You destroyed your career the moment you decided to flash your federal badge at a state court judge while demonstrating constitutional ignorance in federal supremacy complex that has no basis in law. Judge Caprio walks closer to the defendant's stand, his full constitutional authority on display. Agent Webb, let me share something with you about federal authority and constitutional law. I've been practicing law for 45 years. I've handled federal cases, constitutional appeals, and jurisdictional disputes. I've worked with federal agencies, federal prosecutors, and federal judges. I understand federal authority better than agents who think their badges make them constitutional scholars. The judge's voice takes on the tone of a constitutional law professor addressing a failing student. The Constitution doesn't establish federal supremacy over everything. Agent Webb, it establishes limited federal authority within specific constitutional boundaries. When you're speeding through a school zone in your personal car, you're not exercising federal authority. You're violating state law like any other citizen. Webb stands frozen, his earlier federal swagger completely destroyed. You walked into my courtroom today thinking you could intimidate a state judge with your federal badge in your 18 years of experience. Instead, you've demonstrated exactly why some federal agents are dangerous. They confuse their investigative authority with constitutional immunity. Judge Caprio returns to his bench, preparing to deliver his final constitutional judgment. A federal agent who shows disrespect for state judicial authority is the same agent who shows disrespect for constitutional boundaries. An FBI agent who thinks traffic laws don't apply to him is the same agent who thinks constitutional limits are suggestions rather than requirements. The judge picks up his gavel. Agent Webb, your $400 fine is now $900 with court costs. Your contempt citation carries an additional $500 penalty. But most importantly, you'll be explaining to the Office of Professional Responsibility why a state court judge has serious concerns about your understanding of constitutional authority and federal-state relations. Webb's voice is barely a whisper. Your Honor, please, I'm not finished. Agent Webb, you mentioned that your federal badge carries more weight than local traffic enforcement. Let me tell you what carries real weight in this constitutional system. Respect for the law, understanding of jurisdictional boundaries, and recognition that no badge, federal, state, or local, exempts anyone from constitutional accountability. Judge Caprio looks out at the packed courtroom, including several federal agents who had come to watch their colleagues' hearing. Let this be a lesson to every federal law enforcement officer watching. Your badge represents service to the Constitution, not supremacy over it. Your oath is to support and defend the Constitution, not to exempt yourself from the state laws that operate within constitutional boundaries. He looks back at Webb, who stands with his head bowed in complete federal humiliation. Agent Webb, I strongly recommend that you spend some time studying the constitutional principles you've sworn to uphold. Federal authority is not unlimited authority. Federal badges do not grant immunity from state law, and federal agents are not above the constitutional system they've sworn to serve. Judge Caprio raises his gavel. Court is adjourned. The gavel comes down with finality, but the story doesn't end there. What happened in the following weeks would prove exactly why challenging state judicial authority with federal arrogance always leads to career destruction. As the courtroom emptied, Webb stood alone at the defendant table, staring down at the citation that had just cost him $1,400 and potentially his federal career. The federal superiority complex that had carried him through 18 years of FBI work had been systematically dismantled by a 76-year-old state court judge who never raised his voice. Assistant Special Agent in Charge Patricia Morrison, Webb's direct supervisor, had been in the gallery watching the entire proceeding. She approached Webb as he gathered his belongings, her expression a mixture of professional disappointment and constitutional embarrassment. "Agent Webb," she said quietly, "I watched that entire hearing. That judge just gave you a master class in constitutional law that you clearly never learned at Quantico." Webb looked up at her, his earlier federal confidence completely shattered. "Sack Morrison, I didn't think it would escalate. Marcus, this is exactly the kind of federal arrogance that undermines our relationships with state and local law enforcement. You just embarrassed the entire Bureau by demonstrating constitutional ignorance while wearing our badge." As Webb walked out of the courthouse, federal news reporters who had witnessed his constitutional destruction followed him with cameras. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues who had watched the live stream. The video of his federal humiliation would be viewed over 3 million times in the first 48 hours. Law enforcement blogs analyzed Judge Caprio's systematic constitutional education of Webb as a perfect example of state judicial authority properly checking federal law enforcement overreach. Federal training me's began using the exchange as a teaching tool about constitutional boundaries and proper federal-state relations. Within days, the Office of Professional Responsibility opened a formal investigation into Webb's conduct and constitutional competence. The transcript of his courtroom behavior combined with his public display of federal badge intimidation led to immediate suspension pending disciplinary review. 3 weeks later, Webb was summoned to appear before the FBI's disciplinary board. The recording of his constitutional ignorance and badge-flashing incident, combined with Judge Caprio's judicial finding of federal authority abuse, painted a picture of an agent whose arrogance posed a genuine threat to federal-state relations and constitutional governance. The board's decision was swift and decisive. Webb was terminated from federal employment, his security clearance was revoked, and he was barred from future federal law enforcement positions. The FBI issued a formal apology to Judge Caprio and the Rhode Island state court system. Former Agent Webb's attempt to return to law enforcement 6 months later was a study in federal consequence. No federal agency would hire him due to his constitutional violations. State and local law enforcement agencies rejected his applications based on his documented abuse of authority and disrespect for judicial proceedings. Years later, Webb would tell law enforcement students, "Judge Caprio didn't end my federal career to humiliate me. He ended it to protect the Constitution from agents who think their badges make them above the law. He taught me that federal authority without constitutional understanding is just federal tyranny with a badge." The video of that Monday morning became one of the most watched federal accountability moments ever recorded, shared millions of times across social media platforms. Federal agencies around the world used it as training material about the importance of constitutional boundaries and respect for state judicial authority. But for those who knew Judge Caprio personally, it was simply another example of what made him special: the ability to defend constitutional principles with dignity, to educate through justice, and to transform federal arrogance into constitutional accountability. He proved that state judicial authority is not inferior to federal law enforcement power. It's a co-equal branch of government that serves as a crucial check on federal overreach. In a time when federal-state relations are often strained, Judge Frank Caprio showed that constitutional governance works best when everyone, federal agents included, remembers that no badge grants immunity from the law, no authority is unlimited, and no government employee is above the constitutional system they've sworn to serve and protect.